Animatronic Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, addressed the UN Security Council yesterday, saying this. The most relevant portion of his 14-minute blathering was about the U.S. posture towards Iran and what he's calling futilely, to be sure, on the UN Security Council and other member nations of the UN to do vis-a-vis Iran. Take a listen.
It is no secret to anyone in this room or on this council that for years Iran has supported Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other groups that continue to carry out attacks on Israel. Iranian leaders have routinely threatened to wipe Israel off the map. In recent weeks, Iran's proxies have repeatedly attacked U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria, whose mission is to prevent ISIS from renewing its rampage. So, let me say this before this council, and let me say what we've consistently said to Iranian officials through other channels. The United States does not seek conflict with Iran. We do not want this war to widen. But if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. personnel anywhere, make no mistake, we will defend our people, we will defend our security swiftly and decisively. To all the members of this council, if you, like the United States, want to prevent this conflict from spreading, tell Iran, tell its proxies, in public, in private, through every means, do not open another front against Israel in this conflict. Do not attack Israel's partners.
You know, that's all well and good, except America could take Tony Blinken's own advice. This regime could take his advice. On October 18th, Transition Day. How much publication of that did you see in the D.C. press corps? Transition Day under the Iran nuclear deal. With it passed the UN missile and drone sanctions. Iran's terrorist proxies and foreign clients such as Vladimir Putin send their regards, is what the Wall Street Journal opined. Continuing on just a bit, a core problem with the 2015 nuclear talks was the key restrictions were allowed to sunset, at which point Iranian activities would be stamped legal. The arms embargo was allowed to expire in October 2020. Missile and drone limits followed last week. The idea at the time was that the nuclear deal would cause Iran to moderate its malign behavior to fit the Western timetable. How's that going?
That expired at midnight our time, and nobody talked about it. Nobody, just a few. We briefly mentioned it here, but besides that, maybe Fox News.
And so the focus on Iran didn't last very long because, of course, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres offered the typical false equivalences that you would get from an Ivy League professor in his remarks about the Hamas terrorist attack. He condemned the attack in one breath, and then what did he say in the next?
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. The relentless bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces, the level of civilian casualties, and the wholesale destruction of neighborhoods continue to mount and are deeply alarming. Protecting civilians does not mean ordering more than 1 million people to evacuate to the south, where there is no shelter, no food, no water, no medicine, and no fuel, and then continuing to bomb the south itself. I am deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza.
And that prompted this response from Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, who called for Boris Badenov's resignation there.
The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism. And the SG is blaming the victim? You are blaming Israel? This is a pure blood libel. This is a pure blood libel, and I think that the Secretary General must resign, because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building.
Yeah, well, was there before that? Yeah, you know, Gutierrez can go away and maybe they can appoint Liv Tyler or Angelina Jolie to be UN Secretary General. I mean, it's about that important, frankly. For more on all this, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement. He's also a former Navy lieutenant commander, author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and by the way,
this just in.
He's a candidate for Congress in Arizona 4. Is that your mom's district?
No, it is not.
No,
Because
too
I was going
bad.
to say he'll for sure have a vote, but sorry.
Well, it's Arizona. She can
It's
probably
Mesa,
vote.
Gilbert, Chandler, you know.
She can probably vote wherever she wants in Arizona,
Exactly.
from what we've seen.
Tucson, Phoenix, same thing.
Dr. Jasser, thanks so much for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
Whatever sort of Pollyannish prospects Tony Blinken thought he had to bring the UN Security Council and the larger member nations to consensus on this, to speak with one voice and condemn Iran and act in furtherance of that condemnation, that seemed to go by the boards pretty quickly.
Oh, it did. He's like the dysfunctional weatherman who has a hurricane that came and says that somehow he was surprised by it and just starts describing the hurricane that he laid out over the past multiple years of actually saying the opposite to the UN. When Iran declared its intention, when Iran has long called for the death and destruction of Israel and the West, they said, oh, that's just words, it doesn't mean anything. And now that it does mean anything, he's saying that the UN needs to respond to it. It's absurd, it's offensive, and you listen to their expectation in the UN of no response. One thing I'd remind them is they called for a day of jihad. These Islamists want to light up the Middle East. They want to create death and destruction. That's the way Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda work, because it rebrands them. It gives the population there that has the ones that don't have any moral agency, that have lost their moorings and lost their humanity, a chance to say they're the ones that will represent the will of the Palestinians, when in fact the Palestinians and the Arabs and those that do have morality, like the Iran women's movements, those that were pushing back against their dictatorships, they didn't participate in this day of jihad. The women's movement actually was rejecting the theocrats of Iran, and in the past few weeks has been saying they stand with Israel, they stand against terrorism. So, I think it's long overdue for the Palestinians to have an Arab awakening against their own tyrants, which are Hamas. And, the Israelis were releasing leaflets the past few days and dropping them and saying, if any of you know where these hostages are, let us know. We want to minimize civilian loss. And, that's the story you're not hearing from the propagandist arms of the BBC and other media that seem to have a one side in which they, and actually I have to tell you, as a Muslim, as the son of immigrants, that it is bigotry to me to say that somehow we don't have any moral agency, that somehow there's a justification for, if you look at the manual that Hamas had that was revealed by NBC, no right-wing media, this is a left-wing media that released a manual that said 8 points. Point 1 and 2 of the hostage taking was to go in and slaughter women and children at the festivals, at the schools, and elsewhere. Nowhere do you see that the taking of the hostages is being condemned roundly. They just sort of say it as a footnote, and then they go on to say, well, they've been oppressed, et cetera, et cetera. Enough is enough. We need to decimate Hamas's leadership, and then after that talk about what is the path forward for Palestinians that are part of humanity, part of civilization, and not part of evil.
Well, what should the path forward be?
The path forward has to first be to release these hostages safely to their families, The path forward first has to be to completely end the military arm, and also political arm of Hamas needs to be defeated, no different than Germany was defeated in World War II, no different than any of the enemies of humanity have been defeated. And, I have to tell you, the Syrians, for example, should not have a long memory to know that Hamas did not support the revolution in Syria. Hamas supported Assad, supported Iran in their regional aspirations. So the path forward needs to be to end those who are the enemies of humanity first in the next few weeks in this war, and hopefully minimize the loss of civilian life, as is always horrific in war. But it's one thing to end who started this war, and then after that start to create corridors of humanity to bring sustenance to those who are suffering, and begin to create a new leadership in the Palestinian territories.
With respect to Iran, what's their end game here? Blinken, we don't want conflict with Iran. It doesn't seem like Iran really wants to formally put its fingerprints on this, to engage more than they have in terms of providing weapons and whatever other logistical support they provide to terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. It seems like maybe they're just trying to use this as a time when they can advance their weapons program that Obama started helping them to advance several years back. Is that what they're really aiming to do at this point?
It's a couple things. Three things I would say is involved here. Number one is to distract from their internal weakness in the revolution. All of a sudden the topic has changed across the Middle East. No one's paying attention to the women's movement anymore. Number two is to begin to inflame a lot of their proxies. The Houthis should be declared a terrorist organization. I'll remind you that the Biden administration a year ago removed the designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, and now they're launching missiles again. And so that needs to happen. Number three is to solidify the Abraham Accords. They wanted to, they saw Saudi Arabia, a lot of the Arab Gulf countries beginning to normalize economic relations with Israel, which would be a disaster for Iran. And also, by the way, the new axis of evil, Iran, China, and Russia, are creating a strengthening of their triangular power, if you will, and that also has been rekindled. And we need to also, push back against. So those three areas are the reasoning behind it. They met, with the head of Hamas leadership in Tehran just weeks before this happened, and began to increase sort of the verbal attacks against Israel in the West. And lo and behold, the war started a few weeks later. So this should not have been a surprise. There's a lot of secondary gains that they have from it, and always as they do in proxy wars. And we need to have them pay a price, not only in the loss of their weaponry, but also intelligence.
Maybe, for example, reinstituting the arms embargoes?
Yeah, exactly. The maximum pressure campaign needs to come back. I don't understand why Blinken and company don't say that the Pompeo maximum pressure campaign worked. This would not have happened under that campaign. They removed it, and here we are now. The Middle East is on fire.
Well, so NSC spokesman John Kirby, who has become almost as risible a figure as Karine Jean-Pierre, with the statements he makes, like giving Biden an A+ on the management of this crisis in the Middle East, as well as the crisis in Eastern Europe. John Kirby said this about Iran-sponsored attacks, because, of course, Iran is sponsoring attacks on U.S. troops in other theaters outside of Gaza. Take a listen.
Now, we know these groups are supported by the IRGC and the regime. We know Iran continues to support Hamas and Hezbollah. And we know that Iran is closely monitoring these events, and in some cases actively facilitating these attacks and spurring on others who may want to exploit the conflict for their own good or for that of Iran. We know Iran's goal is to maintain some level of deniability here, but we're not going to allow them to do that. We also are not going to allow any threat to our interest in the region to go unchallenged. We demonstrated last...
Yeah, that's all, those pieties are all well and good, but we have U.S. soldiers being attacked by Iran using weapons we've allowed them to obtain.
Now they're going to not allow it when they've actually planted the seeds which Iran felt they could do anything they wanted to, in which they facilitated Assad's continued ascension in his country, and the crimes against humanity that he did, and the troops that they sent into Syria to decimate that population. And then Lebanon now is completely a third world country, a country that's been destroyed as a result of Iran's fueling of Hezbollah. Now they're saying they're not going to do that. I mean, that's offensive. And the appeasement policy that they've had has basically been a green light to the ascendancy of that Shia crescent from Iran through Iraq. I mean, when is the establishment in Washington going to realize that the reason we lost Iraq was not necessarily that it was a fool's plan, but the bottom line was that Obama administration handed it over to Iran. And that type of division in the Middle East between Iran and the Arab countries, that crescent, is going to actually create a conflict in which if Iran gets nuclear weapons, then we're going to talk about Saudi Arabia getting nuclear weapons. And the concern now of this conflict broadening beyond Israel and Hamas is very significant, because remember, at the end of the day, Iran's suicidal Hezbollah and terrorist organizations goes beyond simply non-state actors. The IRGC was declared a terror organization because they have state-wished suicidality, as they declare every time they open the UN and they call for the coming of the 12th Imam. The 12th Imam will come at the end of times when the Middle East is ablaze and afire, and Jerusalem's on fire. So that's the way they see it. And that's why they should have had deterrence back during the Obama administration, and not just talking about it now when our ally Israel is having to defend itself after an attack.
Kind of a pedestrian question, but why are you running for the House of Representatives for Arizona's Fighting Fourth?
Well, I'm running because my parents came to this country to participate in the religious freedom of Americanism, of an idea that was not only a city on a hill, but a promise of freedom, of free speech. That diversity was not just about identity politics, but it was about diversity of ideas, and we're losing that. We're seeing the wokists work with the Islamists and the spread of anti-Semitism on campuses. I saw through COVID primary care and medicine destroyed by a government intervention, and small businesses destroyed. And I've seen the weaponization of government against the American people, and seeing things that I thought only happened in the Middle East beginning to happen here. And, now with this war, I'm reminded more than ever, and as my family told me they wanted me to run because of these issues. So I'd like to renew America's promise, flip the district that we're in. It's currently a Democrat district with Stanton, and it can be flipped. It was split 49-49 in the presidential part of the ballot last time, and it can be won with a strong candidate. And I'd like to give the antidote to the Ilhan Omars of Congress, who really are anti-American and seem to be filling an American congressional seat, and I'd like to do the opposite.
No, that would be fun to watch you go toe-to-toe with Omar and Tlaib and the others. That would be
amazing.
That'd be worth sitting down with a tub of popcorn and watching. Z for AZ, Z is in Zuhdi for AZ, zforaz.com is his campaign website. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, President, American Islamic Forum for Democracy, co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement, former Navy Lieutenant Commander, author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and Republican candidate for Congress in Arizona, Arizona 4, z4az.com. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is